This story is The Green Man. Once upon a time, there was a young man named Claude. He was the son of a rich man, Squire Archibald. Claude had a pretty easy life. He had already done his studies, and he was living on his parents' estate, and he always got whatever he needed, and whatever he wanted. So if he wanted eggs for breakfast, he called down to the cook, sent a servant down and said, "I want eggs easy over on toast up in my room." Or if he wanted to sleep in, he'd leave instructions that leave him alone and let him sleep in. Or if he wanted to stay up late reading, he would walk about on the estate, and he was a bit of a snob. He would sort of hold his nose up to those people who had to work hard with their body for a living, those who were cutting the wheat in the fields, and those who were digging to plant. And he thought, those poor things, they don't know how to read. They just have to do physical work. They just don't know any better. Like I said, he was a bit of a snob. One of his favorite things to do was to go hunting. And he would get his father's men and some dogs, and they would go off for the day. Or he'd go fishing or take walks. He loved to read. He pretty much did whatever he felt like doing whenever he felt like it. I think some grown-ups would say he was a little spoiled. He was the only son of Squire Archibald and his wife. Now one day, one of his other favorite things to do was to go into town and hang out at an inn or two, drink a few beers, and just talk to everyone, keep his eye out on the young maidens. And it was one evening, I think it was in the winter. Yes, it was in the winter, that he made his way down to the Mermaid in the Bush. That was the name of that inn. He made his way down to the Mermaid in the Bush, and he ordered a meal, and he sat facing the window looking out. And he saw people going outside their doors. This was near dark, putting plates of food outside their doors and going back in. And these were poor people in the town. So he said to the innkeeper, "Sir, what are those people doing?" And the innkeeper looked out and he said, "Oh, those people, they're putting out food for the Green Man." "The Green Man?" "Well," said Claude, "the Green Man?" And the innkeeper said, "Yes, they're putting out food for the Green Man. They believe the Green Man takes care of their crops, takes care of the animals, both their flocks and in the wild, and looks out for young children in the forest. And they know the Green Man probably doesn't have much food for the winter, so they put out food for him every night." "That's ridiculous," said Claude. "That's an old wives' tale. And look at those people. They're poor and they're putting out food for somebody else. That's ridiculous." And he went back to his meal and joining his friends. Well, that spring ended up being a beautiful spring, much like ours. Just a gorgeous spring. Over here right now, the apple trees are blooming, the hayfields are green, the cherries are blooming. It's a special time, and the trees are all leafing out. And Claude decided what a great time to go hunting. In fact, it was later than now because, as you'll see, he decided to go hunting. So he called his father's men and the dogs, and they got all set up on their horses and their saddlebags, and off they went. Somebody blew a trumpet, and off they went hunting. And they went hunting, and they got deeper and deeper in the woods, and they caught sight of a big stag. And off the men went. Well, before you knew it, they got separated. The men went that way, Claude went that way, and before you knew it, he couldn't hear their trumpet anymore. He called, he couldn't hear anybody. And the day got hotter and hotter. As he kept his horse going through the forest, he realized he was really lost. But he kept going. He wasn't that afraid. He figured his father's men would find him. And he was also really hot. He was covered head to toe in leathers for hunting, and it was a really hot day. Well, he followed down a path, and it came to a magnificent big pool, a deep blue pool of water, a spring. And he looked around and he said, "There's nobody out here." He took off all his clothes and jumped in. It was so refreshing. It felt so good. He splashed around in that water, just got all the sweat off of him, enjoyed the coolness. While he was doing that, somebody else was nearby. And that somebody else reached a bony hand and picked up very quietly Claude's clothes and put them on, and went over to Claude's horse and took Claude's horse and just walked away. All he left was an old piece of rope. Well, Claude finally got out of the water. That was great. Oh, and look, there's strawberries. So it must have been mid-June because there were strawberries. There's strawberries. I'm hungry. I haven't eaten since breakfast. He started picking the strawberries and ate them, and then he said to himself, might as well get dressed and see if I can find my men. And he looked around. He couldn't find his clothes. What? He couldn't find his clothes. He didn't understand. He saw a piece of rope there. That was where he put his clothes. Well, he didn't know what to do. He wasn't walking around naked. He was too much of a young man to, most people don't like doing that. So he put the rope around his waist, and he found a bunch of big beech leaves and other big leaves, some grape leaves, and he tied them around until he had a little covering there in the front and the back. And then he ate some more strawberries, and he started walking down the path. Well, the path didn't seem to go nowhere. He came back to the pond. He walked down a different path. That didn't seem to go anywhere either. And the one thing he did know is that when you're lost, you don't want to get more lost. We have the expression hug a tree. You just stay with that tree until somebody finds you. But he knew if he went down a path, he could always come back that path. So he took different paths off from the pond, but he didn't hear his father's men, and he didn't find his way to a big trail that people would be going on. And he began to get a little worried because it was beginning to get dark. He was looking up and the sun was going down. What was he going to do? Well, he went down another path, and this path led to look like a cave, some sort of ledges, big overhanging ledges with a cave inside. And he thought to himself, well, if worse comes to worse, I'll stay in this cave tonight and I'll find the trail back to town tomorrow. And it was beginning to get dark quickly. And as he got inside the cave, he saw some big fiery eyes at one end of the cave, and he shouted, "Go away! I'm armed! Stay away!" And whoever it was didn't say anything. And as he went a little deeper in the cave, he heard rustling way back in the cave. He was fearful. He just sat right there and huddled himself and sat there until, before he knew it, he fell asleep, and he slept through the night. When he woke up, everything looked different. First of all, he saw he was in a cave. He looked around. I'm in a cave, but it was clear that somebody had been living there. First of all, this nanny goat came up and licked his hand and licked his face. And he looked at her and realized that was who he had seen during the night with the fiery eyes. It was the nanny goat in the back of the cave. And he saw how she was full of milk. And she was nudging him. And he said to himself, "Boy, I'm starving. Oh, I'm so hungry." He saw a clay cup on the shelf. He put it under the nanny goat's udder. He had never milked before, but he'd seen people do it. And he pulled until milk came out. And he pulled both udders till he got enough milk out for himself and enough milk that she was relieved. And he drank the warm goat milk. And warm goat milk is delicious. He felt much better immediately. And he looked around the cave and he saw a few chickens were walking around. They were hens. And he saw that they had a nest in the cave and they had laid some eggs. And then he saw where there had been a fire and some ashes, and he saw some cast iron fry pans hanging up, just a couple, and some baskets with grain in them, and an axe hanging on the wall, and a pitcher hanging on the wall. And he realized this was somebody's cave, and he was really grateful to whoever let him stay there because he didn't ask permission, but he was going to be really careful. And he decided to make a little fire, and he cooked some eggs. And then the chickens were all barking at him, and they were pecking at him. And he realized they were hungry. So he saw the grain in the basket, and he gave them a little bit of grain. And then he went outside, and the nanny goat was rubbing against him, and he picked some grass for her and gave her some grass. Well, he figured out it was time for him to be finding his way home. So he left the cave the way it was. He stood up and he started walking down the path. And the first thing he came to was that pool of water where he had found himself initially. And there were strawberries growing there. So he ate his full of strawberries. And then he noticed just a little bit that he was just getting a little hazy, like he was losing his interest in going home, even though he really, really wanted to go home and get out of this outfit he was in. But anyhow, he started walking down different paths, but he always came back to the pool of water. None of the paths seemed to go anywhere. They all ended somewhere, and he was afraid of bushwhacking through the forest, that he would definitely get lost. So he tried all the different paths during the day, and he came back to the pool of water. He went swimming. He put back on his rope with his leaves, And he went back in the cave and he saw the nanny goat and the chickens, and he fed them a little, and he saw a blanket down on the floor of the cave, and he laid down and he fell asleep. This went on for a few days, and each day he became a little bit less Claude and a little bit more someone else. He became a little less worried about himself, a little less concerned about what he was wearing, what he was going to do, who he was going to see, what he was going to eat, and just more interested in everything around him. He noticed the leaves out on the trees. He noticed the deer were standing down the path looking at him, and he would sit and wait, and they would come up to him and then walk away. He noticed the hedgehogs. There was a whole family of hedgehogs who would come up to him and walk away. There was a whole family of skunks, and they were the cutest. The mama skunk with her baby skunklets, and each one was a different color. Some of them had a little stripe down the back, some of them had a big stripe down the back, some of them didn't have any stripes on their tails. And they were very cute. The skunklets all kind of cheeped and perked, and it was fun to watch them. And he kept remembering something vaguely, like he should be going back home, but every day he forgot more and more. One day he was out walking, and he came across a tree, and he heard the buzz of a swarm of bees, and he looked up, and there was a huge beehive just dripping honey. He could see the honeycomb sticking out. Well, he knew what to do about that. He had seen some of his father's workers do that. He went down to the edge of the pool, and he covered himself head to toe thick with mud. That's so the bees don't sting him. He climbed up in the tree, and he had some kind of jug with him, and he pulled a big mass of honeycomb and put it in the jug and said, "Thank you, bees," and was about to start going down the tree when he heard a big horn. And he recognized that horn. That was his father's hunting horn. And he peeked out and he saw there were his father's men. And they were all shouting, "Claude, Claude, are you here? Are you all right? Claude, Claude, answer us." Well, he remembered, I'm Claude, that's right. And he was about to go out and announce himself, but then he looked down at himself. There he was, covered head to toe in mud, with a little skirt of leaves covering his parts he didn't want seen. And he felt a little embarrassed, and he said, I can't go out like this. They'll think I'm crazy. I'll wait. He waited till they passed. He went back down the tree. He walked over to the pond, his little pool of water. He climbed in. He got all cleaned off. But his father's men were gone, and he was already forgetting about them. And he took his honey and he brought it back to his cave. And it was great because he could put the honey in a little bit of goat milk in the morning and heat it up and put a little bit of chicory root in there. And it was just like almost having a cup of coffee. In some ways, it was better. And he would drink that in the morning. In fact, he forgot completely about whoever Claude was. He became the milker of goats. He became the keeper of chickens. He became the friend of all animals, wild and not. And that's how he thought of himself. Claude was some distant, distant character. It was almost as if a spell had befallen him. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. We'll never know. But he began to settle into his cave, and he learned many, many things. The animals helped him find the foods that were good to eat, and he learned about those. He also saw what was in the cave, who had ever been there before was collecting, and he made sure to collect that sort of stuff. There were grains he could collect, there were flowers, there were leaves that he could make teas with, there were roots that he could make soups with. He did all right. He actually had food to eat. A whole lot less meat than he had ever eaten in his life, but he didn't feel the need for meat. He was eating eggs anyhow and the goat milk. So he spent the summer there, wandering in different parts of the forest, always coming back, always sleeping in his cave at night, with the nanny goat next to him and the chickens all around. That was his family. Now one day, it must have been late in July when all those heavy thunderstorms come, at least around here. One day late in July, he could see the big thunderclouds rolling. And he sat in the entrance of his cave and looked out. And he looked out, and all of a sudden he heard this baaing and this mooing. Moo, moo. And then a smaller moo, moo, moo. and he realized that somebody was stuck somewhere in the storm. So he followed his trail out with his nanny goat, and he walked until he came to where there normally was a stream in the woods that he could just walk across, but it had risen very heavily, and there was a calf on one side of the stream and her mother on the other side of the stream, and her mother was mooing at the calf to come join her, but the calf wasn't crossing the stream and the mother wasn't either. So Claude looked at them and said, "I'll get your calf." So he waded through the stream, went over and picked up the calf, brought it back over to the mother, put it at her feet, and the mother looked at Claude and just licked his face in thankfulness. She licked his face and mooed at him, moo, and went off with her calf back to her farm. That's sort of the role Claude had fallen into. He was helping different animals. Now the seasons began to change, and it was beginning to get a little colder. And Claude realized he would have to make himself a whole suit of clothes for the winter, or at least something. So he started weaving together leaves and bits of the hide of dead animals. He would occasionally find the hide of a deer, and he rubbed the hide and rubbed it till it became soft, and he could make himself leggings with it, stitching them together, and he made himself a soft shirt because the days were getting cold. And he, with birch bark, he wove himself a big curtain to put across the front of the cave, and he made a much bigger fire in the center of the cave with a little hole so the smoke could go out. And he started collecting food for the winter. He knew that he would be there for the winter. Just like all the other animals that were in the woods, he started collecting food. One day, he was out collecting acorns. Acorns are wonderful food. Once they're blanched and boiled, you can grind them for flour and make acorn bread and acorn cakes. So he started collecting acorns. One day he was out in the woods collecting acorns, and he heard these screams. Sounded like children. He ran and ran, and there was a huge boar with tusks coming out of his head, a wild boar, and he was threatening two children who were out there with baskets. They were collecting acorns too. Well, he stood in front of the boar and he said, "Shame on you. There's enough acorns here for everyone in the forest. Leave these children alone." Now, if it was me or you, we wouldn't face a wild boar, but Claude knew he had a relationship with all the animals in the forest, so he said, "You hearing me?" And the boar just put his head down and backed away. Now he turned to the children and he said, "Children, are you okay? I'll help you gather acorns." And he helped them gather acorns. And they looked in awe at him. They said, Are you the Green Man?" He was surprised at that. He looked at himself. He had rough skin. His beard had completely filled in because he didn't know how to shave out there. He was completely bearded, all sunburned, covered head to toe in leaves and leather, and green leaves around his chest. He looked at himself and he looked at the children and he said, "Yes, I am the Green Man." And they went, "Yay, we knew the Green Man would help us." And they ran back with their baskets back home. He chuckled to himself, and he went along himself gathering acorns. Well, winter came and it was cold. And somehow he knew, every night he would walk towards the town. He found his way into the town. And after dark, people would leave plates of food for him behind their houses, and he would sometimes go and eat the food, and sometimes he would leave it there for the wild animals, and sometimes he would bring some back for his animals. And he looked longingly at the people in their houses and at the light of the inn, but he knew he had to be in the woods taking care of the animals and taking care of everything. So every night he came back and slept in his cave with a nice fire because he collected firewood for the winter. And every day he looked after the animals. And a family of hedgehogs moved in with him just to stay warm. And various animals had moved in there, but he didn't mind. They were warm and cozy, and they all slept together. Well, the winter finally passed. It was a long winter, but it finally passed. And as spring came, it was glorious. Claude had forgotten, the Green Man had forgotten, just how glorious spring is. Each day was something new. Each day was birds coming back and singing their hearts out, and then leaves coming out. And then one day he went down to the pool of water where he found himself originally, the deep spring, and he saw that the strawberries were just about ripe. And he washed himself and he said to himself, I'm going to come down every day until the strawberries are ripe. They will be delicious. So he came down every day, and one day he came down to the pool of water. And there was a young man splashing in the pool. Obviously he had jumped in there because he was hot. And something in Claude woke up. And he looked around and he saw the pile of clothes by the edge of the pool. And he went over and he took off all of his stuff that he had on and left the rope down there and went over and very quietly put on the clothes that the young man had left there. And then walked over to the young man's horse and got on, and off he rode. He rode, he didn't even know how he did it or why, but he rode until he came home to the manor house. And when he knocked on the door, his father answered the door. Now, you have to remember that Claude had been heavily bearded all this time and wasn't exactly the cleanest looking. So his father said, do I know you? And Claude said, Father, it's me. And then his father stood back and said, Wife, come and see, wife. And his wife came over and they both looked at him and they said, Claude, is it you? We thought you were killed by wild animals. And he said, it is me. And they said, how did you survive? And he said, the green man saved me. And after that, whenever anybody asked how he spent a year in the woods, all he said was, the green man saved me. And that's the story of the green man. I hope you meet the green man sometime.